Okay, Jim. Well, let's take it from the top. So I used to be the aviation editor of a magazine called Jane's Defense Weekly. It's a it's still probably the premier military affairs magazine in the world, but it's based here in the UK. I became its aviation editor in 1987. And that was round. It was an interesting time to become editor of that magazine, or aviation editor of that magazine, because there was a lot of interesting stuff happening in the so-called black world of aerospace at the time. Back in the late 80s, there was a huge pile of Reagan era secret spending coming in. There had been stealth projects that had been begun about a decade earlier under Carter. And so Reagan, in 1988, his administration unveiled two secret aircraft programs. One was the F-117 stealth fighter, and the other was the B-2 stealth bomber. The 117 stealth fighter had been totally developed in the black, in complete secrecy. And people had snippets. I mean, I, as a defense journalist professional, had heard, of course, whispers that this aeroplane existed, but it wasn't until it was unveiled that we knew what it looked like, and it came out of the black, as they say.
And where exactly was it built, if you know?
Yeah, well, it was built by the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, a very famous aerospace body that develops technologies secretly in the black. It's been going, has been going since the end of the Second World War, and has developed a lot of secret stuff like the U-2 spy plane, the Lockheed Blackbird, very fast flying, and then latterly in the 1980s it had developed stealth.
And where precisely? The reason I'm asking is that Turber says that these planes that he not planes, craft, Tic Tac craft, were built at Plant 42 in Palmdale, California, where a lot of these black operations happened. Was that Plant 42 around in those days, and is that where you believe this was built?
Sure. I mean, Plant 42 in Palmdale is the home, or was the home, to a number of secret aircraft developments, including the B-2 and the F-117 stealth fighter. So there is precedent for black stuff, secret stuff, having been built out there in the Mojave Desert. No question about that. I think the question that we have to ask ourselves in this whole Tic Tac saga is, could an unprecedented aerospace technology. In fact, actually, aerospace is the wrong word. If you look at the Tic Tac video, aerospace does not describe what we saw there in the conventional sense, which is where the whole thing opens up from being about, my domain. And I'm talking about, a heritage here from the late 1980s of covering this stuff as a reporter, right through the 1990s and into the 2000s. I mean, you asked me about my book, The Hunt for Zero Point. That was my 10-year investigation through the aerospace and defense world into anti-gravity. Could top secret anti-gravity technology have been developed going back years, I mean, decades, right back to the 50s and even the Second World War, to explain what people see as UFOs in the sky? Because I'm a dyed-in-the-wool aerospace and defense guy. I need to kick the tires of stuff to know that it's real. And that's what the book was about. And it was published in 2001. And I'm pleased to say is sort of still rumbling on in cyberspace and elsewhere. So, I sort of have history in this stuff, and it's all come full circle a bit with Tic Tac.
And the conclusion of the book was what, as far as where we are in that hunt?
Well, in the hunt, I go through everything. It started with an enigma, actually, because in the 1950s, a whole bunch of aerospace and defense companies, I mean, well-known household names, even today, like Boeing and Lockheed, started talking about anti-gravity technology as if it was just around the corner. We are on the verge. We're literally on the verge of breaking through with this technology. I hadn't come across this before, and I thought, why isn't anyone talking about this? I mean, this is pretty interesting. If they were talking about this stuff back in the 1950s, why isn't it talked about today? Well, of course, it actually opens up a huge can of worms, because certainly 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when I was investigating this book, this was such a taboo subject. It was like it was a different era. You couldn't talk about anti-gravity. You couldn't talk about UFOs without being dismissed as some kind of crank. So I had to investigate this stuff on the sly. So I was going about my day-to-day investigative 9-to-5 reporting. But in the meantime, wherever I went, I was asking this question. Psst, do you think top secret anti-gravity technology could have been developed since the 1950s? And bit by bit, I sort of got people to talk. And they were very reluctant for the reasons I said. They didn't want to be seen as cranks. Hell, I didn't want to be seen as a crank. I mean, I was really worried about losing my job at Jane's, which was an incredibly respected publication. But bit by bit, I kind of eked the story out. It went from the Nazi era, when, sure enough, the Nazis were looking at some pretty esoteric stuff. It went through the 1950s, which is where, as I said, I picked the story up. Through the 60s, it kind of went a bit dead. Then in the 70s, we started getting that sort of stealth stuff that I spoke about at the beginning, where people were seeing things in the night skies over the Nevada desert they couldn't explain. Is that a flying saucer? Don't know. And then it went on into the 1980s, when NASA started testing anti-gravity technology. Now, by the end, I did not find a single piece of smoking gun evidence to say that the US or anyone else had developed this stuff. But there was lots of circumstantial evidence to show that people were very interested. They've always been interested in it. The black world of aerospace and defense technology is interested in any breakthrough, however ridiculous the premise might seem at the beginning. So no smoking gun, but lots of circumstantial evidence that this had been looked at for decades.
And talk briefly about the science of it. Is it ridiculous or is it not? Because, as you point out, scientists have been talking about this for a long time.
Sure, they have. No, the science, isn't ridiculous. Yes, it is currently, obviously impossible according to the Newtonian, Einsteinian vision version of physics. There is no anti-gravity force that has been discovered. Now, cut forward 20 years since I wrote that book, and we're beginning to see the emergence of some physics that does begin to explain that. It's no accident that I called that book The Hunt for Zero Point. Zero point actually refers to something called zero point energy. More recently, though, that zero point energy is known as something called vacuum fluctuations. The easiest way to explain that, Jim, is that space, empty space, as classical physics always understood it, is now deemed by quantum physicists not to be empty at all. It is teeming with background fluctuations of little particles that pop out of literally nowhere and fill empty space. Now, the theory is that if you can perturb those vacuum fluctuations, and physicists are now looking at ways to do that, according to the theory, you may be able to get some kind of anti-gravity effect, because those fluctuations are the substrate from which all the forces that we know about, electromagnetism, gravity, the strong and the weak nuclear force, all of those forces are now deemed to flow from those little itty-bitty vacuum fluctuations that fill empty space. And this is only now beginning to be realized and recognized. So is the US military interested in those vacuum fluctuations? Is it interested in zero-point technology? Absolutely it is. Has it cracked the conundrum? Well, that's a whole different matter. And, I always err on the side of caution. But, for the purposes of this subject and for the purposes of Tic Tac, of course, it's fun to speculate.
And what about the Reagan Star Wars program? Was that really the beginning of this big push for black projects in the 80s?
No, not really. As I said, in the real stimulus for black projects was the stealth revolution, which kind of kicked off in the late 1970s, but it really got going in the 80s when the Reagan administration just flowed untold billions of black dollars into stealth. And out of that, as I said, emerged the F-117 stealth fighter, the B-2 stealth bomber, and a number of other secret programs that we're only just beginning to see today.
But couldn't some of that money also have been going to anti-gravity projects?
It could have. I mean, if physicists had made the breakthrough, it could have. But, as we've been discussing, the issue is, had physics made the breakthrough? I mean, this is it's bigger than the physics breakthrough that led to the bomb in the Second World War. That was the triumph of theory over programmatics. It was the theory behind the bomb that led to the bomb being detonated in 1945, the atom bomb. There is no evidence to say, as we were discussing earlier, that physicists have made a breakthrough that allows them to develop nuts and bolts hardware that lead.
Sorry, you just your audio cut out a little bit. Sorry, keep going.
I kind of wrapped up there. The wrap was to say there is no theory that allows us to believe that a breakthrough has been made in anti-gravity.
Mm-hmm. Have you heard of Sandy Kidd?
Yes.
Out of Scotland.
Yeah, I've heard of Sandy Kidd out of Scotland. In fact, I think he might have crept into the hunt for 0 Point by way of a mention, nothing more.
Okay. Is there any particular discovery that he made that's particularly relevant that you recall?
I mean, the thing is, as I say, 10 years of investigations led to loads of what I call, backroom inventors, guys who tinkered around with bits of technology in their garden shed. This is no disrespect to Sandy Kidd, but, that was the sort of level at which he was investigating this stuff. It was literally tinkering around with bits of hardware, somewhere at the bottom of his garden. He was one of them. There are probably dozens of others who've come out of the woodwork to say they've developed stuff, but there is no hard and fast evidence to say that they did. Otherwise, trust me, I'd have a bit of that kit. I'd have the kit on my desk and I'd be flying it around now in front of you.
Well, is it fair to summarize the scientific community as believing that this is possible? The laws of physics allow for this possibility. It's a matter of figuring out exactly how to do it, and it's something that will, if it hasn't been discovered already, will eventually be discovered, as opposed to no, these guys are crackpots, and this is not possible.
Listen, I am all for what is possible, and in fact, actually, one of the things that infuriates me about science is the sort of conventional science world's view that new breakthroughs in this sort of area will never be possible. A lot of scientists just say this is never going to happen, period. But we have to remember that 20 years ago, it was only just over 20 years ago, that it was discovered that the universe, the universe is expanding, and the rate of expansion, contrary to what science taught us, is not slowing down at all. It's actually accelerating. That has led to a discussion about dark matter and dark energy. I'm sure you've heard about that discussion. It's what cosmologists are talking about all the time now. What is dark matter and dark energy? Why is it speeding up the acceleration of the universe? Is telling us. Well, the fact is 95% of the known universe is made up of this stuff. Only 5% of the universe is made up of stuff, matter that we understand. And yet science still says that 5% is what we should be paying attention to, and the 95% is just simply beyond us. Well, I don't believe that. I believe that science, if it is prepared to look at things with a rigorous, curious eye, will uncover these anomalies, and in time, and these anomalies will become things that are known. I mean, that's just the direction of science. So anti-gravity, sure, there is nothing to say it exists at the moment, but I've no doubt that in the future, if it hasn't already been discovered somewhere in the black, it will be made manifest. It will appear. We'll crack it.
What do you think about these U.S. Navy patents that were issued this year? Have you had a chance to look at those?
I've had a brief look at them. I think it's really intriguing. I think, of course, it's doubly intriguing that when the Tic Tac video emerges, other things pop out of the woodwork as well, like these US Navy patents that describe something remarkably similar. Does that mean that the Navy has developed something like this in the black, in secret? Not necessarily. As I routinely found when I was going through my research in the Hunt for Zero Point, disinformation in this sphere is rife. It is everywhere, and it suits a lot of people to muddy the waters, because when you have muddied waters, which is what you have all the time with the UFO phenomenon, you can hide a whole load of stuff in there that you might want to hide, a whole load of secret stuff, and it becomes a very convenient smokescreen for stuff to be hidden in and behind. So when those patent papers emerged, I'm not saying that they're not real. They might be, but my training tells me to look at that with a very jaundiced eye and to go, whose purposes does this serve by all of this stuff getting out there? Are we trying to fool the Russians? Are we trying to fool the Chinese? Or do we end up just fooling ourselves? And of course, that's the nature of this phenomenon. You get something called blowback that comes with it, and blowback is a CIA term for disinformation operations that then come back to haunt you, because this stuff comes back as an anomaly that you can't explain. But actually, it was probably a rumor or a whisper that you started 15 or 20 years ago. So, we have to watch for this stuff all the time.
Does the science that is described in that patent pass the smell test, in your view?
Well, I have talked to a number of people about it. Again, in theory, I mean, there's lots of stuff that is good about it. It makes sense. It ticks boxes on many, many levels. But then there are other people who say, no, actually, it's just smoke and mirrors. It doesn't pass muster. This is someone just trying to get something through and pass the patent office. To be honest, Jim, I don't know what the truth is. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a physicist. I just look at this with, as I say, a sort of cautionary, jaded eye. The simple truth is in this realm, once you start to look into it, nothing is what it seems.
But at a minimum, it does demonstrate that the U.S. military is noodling around in this area.
Oh, for sure. And I think it's been noodling around in it for an awful long time.
Noodling around with potentially billions of dollars. I think that you pointed out in one of your books that there's at least $20 billion in the defense budget annually that goes into black projects.
Oh, that was then. It's much more like 100 billion now.
I mean, imagine what can be done. I mean, I know the government is masterful at wasting money, so you got to kind of cut that number in half as far as the actual benefit you get from it. But $50 billion a year, if you gave that to Silicon Valley and those guys,
sure.
And you've been doing it for 20 years or 30 years,
longer.
10 billion, longer, 10 billion, 20 billion, 30 billion. I mean, that is a lot of money that ought to be able to result in some pretty significant breakthroughs.
Sure, and we always have to keep an open mind, of course, that it hasn't. I mean, so quite simply, it may have led to a breakthrough, but the whole point about doing that in the black is that you keep it secret. When I was covering stealth projects way back in the 80s, 90s, and in the early 2000s, there were projects there that sources would tell me about, but that have still not seen the light of day. And these are conventional, stealthy aircraft projects that use, regular engines and regular wings and regular tail surfaces. Those haven't emerged to see the light of day in possibly 25, 30 years, some of them. So if you've really developed a breakthrough like anti-gravity, there's no way that you're going to just pop that out of the woodwork and reveal it willy-nilly. Its true benefit is that you keep it secret. You don't want your adversaries to know that you've got it. Now, with Tic Tac, it's interesting because what you may be doing is you may be flushing information out of your adversaries' camps. China and Russia have become resurgent. They are pouring billions of rubles and dollars and all sorts into their own programs, secret programs. You might want to flush out what they themselves are doing with a bit of, by dropping a stone into a metaphorical pond, watching the ripples go out and seeing what comes back. So that maybe that's what Tic Tac is about. But it does appear to be real stuff that real pilots have seen and encountered in skies on both sides of the U.S. seaboard. So it's not a simple story, as we know.
Yeah. Well, let's get to the Tic Tac next. Although I want you raised one question in my mind, and that is the ability to keep secrets. Because one thing that struck me about the possibility that these could be U.S. craft is like, man, it just doesn't seem to me they'd be able to keep that secret. But can you give us some examples of things that the U.S. military was able to keep truly secret for an extended period of time and then ultimately was released?
Sure, absolutely. The stealth fighter, for one, the F-117 stealth fighter built by the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works was prepared in secret with flying demonstrators in the late 1970s. They were never seen. They were never revealed. In 1983, the aircraft actually entered squadron service in a remote base in Nevada called Tonopah. Some 50 aircraft were built and fielded. They flew around the desert Southwest for 5 years. People saw things on sort of moonlit nights they couldn't explain. The F-117 looked pretty odd. I mean, it by conventional airplane, in any conventional airplane sense, it didn't look like an airplane anyone had seen. But it was only in 1988, when that program was revealed by the Reagan administration, that people went, oh my God, this thing is real. So that program, no one spoke. Thousands of people worked on it. In 5 years, it had been in squadron service, and no one revealed it. I mean, there were whispers only about it. So yeah, these things are kept secret, and the secrets hold for a very long time.
And looking back at that one as an example, looking back at it, was there some leaks? Was there anything that was written about it at all or speculated about it during that time period?
There were leaks. There were snippets in Aviation Week, which is a very well-respected trade journal in the US. My own magazine, Jane's Defense Weekly, carried snippets and rumors about this thing because we all have sources in the business. But the great thing about a compartmentalized program, as it's called, in that no one gets to see the big picture, but all the bits of the program are held in silos, is that anyone who leaks information can only leak about the part they know in their particular silo. That's why it's called a compartmentalized program. So those leaks, when they did emerge, were very indistinct. They were very half-based rumors. So yeah, we picked them up, but it was nothing definitive. In that respect, they actually mirror a lot of the stuff that comes out about UFOs, because people talk about UFOs, they get to see so much of the program, but they don't know the whole thing. And, are UFOs real? Does the government know the truth about UFOs? Well, who knows?
Have you picked up any so-called leaks that there is a U.S. military Tic Tac type program such as what Mike Turber is saying? Is he the first to leak this in your view, or have you heard others leak something similar?
Well, okay. Well, I mean, let's talk just a little bit about Tic Tac, in the sense that, the program that monitored unconventional aircraft in in U.S. Airspace and other people's airspace, that was a real program. That was called ATIP, so that was a monitoring program. What you're asking is, was there a program that built technology that looked like Tic Tac? Well, the simple truth is, we don't know. In all my experience of covering aerospace, and I did that job in Jane's for 15 years, I always wanted to follow the money. I'm not. I don't know whether Mike Turber knows this stuff for real or not, but if he doesn't know it for real, if he's not part of the program, he genuinely doesn't know. This stuff is watertight, held secrecy. If he was part of it, then he's a whistleblower and he knows the truth. If he wasn't a part of it, it's really unlikely that he would be given all the facts. That's just not how these black programs work, and it's not how people reveal it. And in fact, the disinformation piece that goes alongside that, as we were talking earlier, is very, very active. And I would be incredibly cautious if I were him or anyone else who is given information from so-called sources who profess to know, that what they are getting is the absolute truth. Because like any good reporter or investigator, I'm sure you'd know this with your background yourself, that you would have to take the information from multiple sources before you yourself declare it to be true.
Okay, so tell me what your reaction was to first seeing that Tic Tac video, and then we've learned about it since.
Well, I saw the videos like everyone else, and my immediate reaction was, that's interesting. A lot of stuff can get faked. But, as we were saying a minute or two ago, as a reporter, as an investigator, as just an analyst of this or any other subject, if you fuse your data from multiple sources, you start to build up a picture of the truth. So the moment I start seeing stories in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, then the Navy itself comes out and says, yeah, this is true. We encountered stuff in our skies that we can't explain. And now we're encouraging our pilots to disclose these encounters when they meet them. They won't be penalized or punished when they do, as happened or might have happened in the past. Then you see the witness testimony of the pilots and their crew who encountered this stuff, and the radar operators on the ships who also received their own data. Now I'm starting to fuse multiple bits of data from all over this story, and it begins to have a feel to it, a shape. So undoubtedly, in my mind, something happened. Something happened in 2004 to the Nimitz carrier group, and I think things have been happening since, which have genuinely perturbed and disturbed the Navy. Otherwise, they wouldn't be coming out with the stories in the papers that they have been, saying this stuff is real. But then you have to take a deeper dive into it. What did they see? That's another question, Jim, and I guess it gets to the nub of what we've been talking about. What technology is it? Whose technology is it? What might it be? What does it mean? It opens up a huge panoply of questions which are really not simple to answer. But at its core, there is a truth. We just don't know what that truth is.
So you do believe that the video is real, and you trust the Navy when they say that, yes, this is real video and that they truly encountered these objects. That part you're believing thus far. He's frozen. Hey, Nick, hold on.
Yeah, I'm reasonably satisfied.
Okay.
Are you getting this? Sorry.
Yeah. Now we got it. Go ahead. Oh. Okay, I think we're good.
Yeah, I'm reasonably satisfied that the reported that it's seen is genuine. So I've seen the witness testimony of Commander Fravor and the others. I don't think these people are lying. I don't think they're making it up. Pilots, they're a very close-knit breed. They have reputations to maintain. You just wouldn't go off and make this stuff up. And as I say, one person might, two people might, but when you get it fused from multiple sources on multiple ships, I just don't think that this stuff has been made up.
So then the very simplistic question in my mind comes, if you go that far, is that, okay, then what is this? The high level being, is it earthly or is it extraterrestrial? Isn't that the obvious first question?
It's the obvious first question, but I don't know that it's the right question, to be absolutely honest. All my sort of experience of investigating conventional aerospace programs, secret aerospace programs, as I've said before, says that we need to be cautious. Secondly, if we're talking about UFOs, I don't think this is a binary question. It's not a binary question of, are these secret government aircraft that we don't know about, or are they extraterrestrial aircraft? There is a whole spectrum of stuff that falls in between those two poles. And to the bigger point about what is the UFO phenomenon, I mean, that for me is the biggest question of all, because it may not even be simply about hardware. It could be a bigger question about consciousness and what we perceive and how we perceive things. And that, of course, is the subject of my new book.
Okay, tell me about that real quick.
So I've just written a book called The Grid. It came out 4 days ago, and it is based on a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, secret military programs. But in that particular case, in the story of The Grid is about, could the government or could governments not just hack into and manipulate data in the way that we've seen in government elections and so forth, but could they actually hack into consciousness itself, the way we think, the way we perceive things, the way we construct reality? And in a sense, the UFO phenomenon falls into that. What we might see a circular object out there, a flying saucer, but there's a lot of weirdness around that sighting. You hear about men in black appearing who take evidence away. The crash retrieval bits that are left behind by these things, if they happen to crash in the desert or somewhere else, are always incredibly elusive. They go missing. They never get paraded in museums or elsewhere. All of that is, to me, smacks of another bigger question, which is our the way we perceive things, is our sense of reality somehow being manipulated and bent out of shape by this phenomenon? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's a pretty intriguing question, and I think it's the one we should start at.
Well, what is the science behind that? What are we aware of that governments or others have been able to develop that could theoretically alter somebody's consciousness?
Well, like I say, I think that science is now beginning to catch up, only very recently, really, on the true nature of reality. As I said earlier, there is an emerging view that the substrate of everything that we see, touch, feel, etc., is actually born these subatomic particles that arise out of nowhere, that fill empty space and give rise to the fundamental forces of nature, of gravity, of electromagnetism, of the things that we literally see, touch, taste, smell, and feel. But they may also give rise to things beyond our five senses, beyond things that we experience reality through customarily. And if that is the case, then UFOs may also manipulate that sort of sixth sense realm. The same realm that remote viewers who were, employed by the CIA back in the 1970s and 80s to go spy psychically on the Soviet Union, that same sort of substrate may be used by them to derive information psychically. And it may well be that same realm that we perceive UFOs on. But that, for me, has become a much more interesting question than simply, is this stuff that people see and report extraterrestrial on the one hand, or secret government aircraft on the other? I think we're dealing with a huge phenomenon here of our age, which is about existence and reality itself, something that physics is really only just starting to get to grips with.
Okay, but in the case of the Tic Tacs off the Nimitz, they were also picked up on this radar off the USS Princeton. So does that take it out of the playing with somebody's consciousness level, and because now we've got it showing up on radar?
No, not at all. I think these things, whatever they are, they appear to zip in and out of dimensional space. So one minute they are in our three-dimensional space, the world that we perceive with our five senses. One minute they're there, and the next minute they're not. They disappear. They disappear off radar. They disappear from view. So I think whatever they are and whoever is manipulating them is able to use that realm I was talking about, this realm of quantum fluctuations of 0-point energy, to literally be in our world one moment and somewhere else the next. I think they're teasing us. I think they're trying to show us something that we don't yet understand.
Who's they?
Well, again, that's the $64,000 big one, isn't it? We don't know. But we are being shown a phenomenon that defies our everyday experience of reality. Let me put it that way.
Well, this idea of altering consciousness and so on, I mean, that sounds to me also like an incredible scientific breakthrough, if it exists. So is that a greater scientific breakthrough than anti-gravity?
It would be just as much, but I think these things are all related. I mean, if we take it back a little bit, we don't know what consciousness is. We don't know that what our experience of self is. Your everyday experience of reality, does that come from within you? Is that born of the electrochemical reactions that go on inside your brain? Or does it come from somewhere else? Is it somehow an off-board experience that somehow we download and experience as everyday reality, in much the same way that my laptop experiences its own reality through some data cloud? I mean, there are analogies there, but given that science is at a loss to explain what consciousness is, Jim, that for me is the starting point. Once you then start to explore your and my everyday sense of what reality and existence is, all kinds of things flow from that. And one of the things is, to the point of the discussion about what we see in the skies and what people see in the skies, is that a three-dimensional object that if you picked up a brick and threw it against that thing, would it go clang, or would it go straight through that UFO, flying saucer, whatever it is, and dematerialize with it. It's those sorts of questions that I think science now has to grapple with. This is not a binary issue. It's not about craft that are either extraterrestrial or government. It's a much bigger question of who we are, what is the world that we perceive around us, and how do we further our understanding, both of ourselves as human beings and of the physics that give rise to our experience of reality.
But if our reality is being manipulated, there's still a question as to whether or not the manipulator is earthly or extraterrestrial.
Correct. Absolutely. I mean, there is. I'm familiar with a wonderful guy called Jacques Vallee. If you've seen the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, you may know Jacques Vallee through the guy who portrayed him on screen, who was the Frenchman Francois Truffaut. So he was. Jacques is a real guy. He's a real explorer of the UFO phenomenon. But latterly, he's become an explorer of something much more fundamental, which is of the whole consciousness thing that we've just been talking about. I've been lucky enough to meet Jacques in New York, and we've spoken a few times. And he's written some incredible books about the UFO phenomenon and the nature of what it is that we're dealing with here. And Jacques' view is very much like my own. In fact, actually, almost identical, in that he thinks that we are being exposed to some form of reality manipulation. Who is doing the manipulation is, of course, that fundamental question. I mean, is it some, extraterrestrial intelligence that's doing it? Unknown. We just don't know. Might it be ourselves? Might it be future versions of ourselves? Again, we don't know. But the weirdness that accompanies the phenomenon, all the strange, there is no conventional aspect to this phenomenon. All of that is perhaps symptomatic of some kind of manipulation of our of the space that the UFO phenomenon sits inside. So, I wish I knew. Your guess is as good as mine, but it's fun trying to, find out.
So when it comes to what the Tic Tac is, it sounds like now you got 4 possibilities, according to you, and let me know if I've missed any, but you've got the fact that it could be real and earthly, it could be real and extraterrestrial, or it could be some type of reality manipulation that's being done earthly, or reality manipulation that's being done by extraterrestrials.
Yeah, or something else we haven't even thought of. I mean, those are just the things that we've been able to funnel down to and discuss because they kind of make sense to us. But it could be that and a whole bunch of other things too.
Okay, so now let's get a little bit more directly into Turber and what he claims. So his background is that he was a U.S. Air Force intelligence specialist for about 4 years in the late 80s, said that he worked on a number of radar systems and electromagnetic tracking, et cetera, all things that I don't fully understand. But that was it, 4 years with the Air Force. We don't really know all the things that he's done since. If you look at his LinkedIn, it's clear that he done some government contract work, et cetera. He lives out close to the Plant 42 area, and apparently has a lot of friends and connections at Plant 42. He says that the radar that picked this up, which you're probably familiar with on the USS Princeton, is a very sophisticated, newer type of radar. It's not the sweeping kind of radar where you get the blip. Do you know what it's called? I forget what the name of the radar is called.
Yeah, it's called Aegis radar. It's a phased array radar system. Yeah.
Okay. So that's the only type of radar that can pick these things up. And he said that type of radar is about to be implemented on a much broader basis, U.S.-wide, if not worldwide, that this technology is becoming a more common form of radar that's going to be used. And therefore, these Tic Tacs that previously were able to fly without being detected are now going to start being detected. And hence the reason why this information now it's okay to start leaking out this information because it's going to be known very soon as a result of the wider use of that type of radar.
What do I think about that?
Yes, let's start there, and then I'll give you more.
Okay, sure. Yeah, no. I mean, no, in the sense that this technology has been around for a while. I mean, it's been around for a long time.
That type of radar, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been around for ages. I mean, the very first job I ever did when I was at Janes was I was flown up to Greenland, and I saw a ballistic missile early warning station up in Greenland at a base called Thule, which uses the exact same technology, phased array radar technology. And this was in 1987. So it's been around for a very long time. It might be being miniaturized and more widely deployed. The F-18s that were vectored to the UFOs by the Aegis radar, they also use a form of phased array radar technology. So, as with all things, they get smaller and they get better and they get more powerful. But the basic technology has been around for ages. And what we hear out of the encounter anyway is that sometimes the aircraft themselves were not able to pick up or track the UFO on their radar. They tracked it on something called their forward-looking infrared, which was where we get those bits of imagery that we see. It's like a infrared movie camera on the aircraft. Those were able to track the aircraft, whereas the radar was not. So again, it's only through sensor fusion. You get radar data from the fleet, you get radar data from the aircraft, you get infrared data from the aircraft, you get eyeball visual eyes on from the pilots. That's called sensor fusion. You can begin to trust that data. You know that, if you were trusting any one source of data for this sighting, well, then you shouldn't. So, my reaction is trust all the data. Don't trust one single piece of it.
Mm-hmm. So then he goes on to state that this is U.S. Air Force technology, that they knew that the Nimitz was conducting their training exercises at the time and that they would therefore pick up these out there, and they were basically testing them to see how the Navy would respond to them. They knew that the Navy, when they fly their test flights, that they're unarmed, and so there's no fear that they're going to attempt to shoot these things down. And furthermore, Navy commanders were aware of this Air Force exercise, and so they were confident sending these guys up there unarmed, because that did strike me as a little bit odd that, wow, you're seeing these unidentified objects out there and you're just going to send planes with no weapons on them at all to just go check them out. That would seem to me to be arguably a dangerous mission. But if high-level Navy command knew what was going on, that's why they would feel comfortable sending these pilots out there to check them out without manned aircraft.
Well, listen, I mean, I don't know, again, whether, I mean, it's always possible that might be true, that scenario, but based on my experience, I consider it highly unlikely. It's almost ludicrous, I think, to presume that you would send up your own secret stuff against another service in the employ of your own country. That would be a highly risky maneuver. I don't know, because I just don't have the data, as to whether those aircraft, the Navy F-18s, were armed or unarmed. But I mean, you would have no guarantee that they weren't armed. So,
well, Fravor did say, one of the squadron commander, he did say that they were unarmed, and he said that they're always unarmed when we're doing exercises because you don't want any accidents.
Well,
and by the way, sorry to interrupt, but Turber saying that no, high-level Navy command was aware of it. It's just that the pilots themselves and anybody below a certain level was not aware of this exercise that was going on.
Well, like I say, anything is possible, but it would be a really, really strange way of doing things. You don't test top secret stuff in a random way like that. In my experience, or in my experience of having spoken to people over 3 decades of covering this stuff. But again, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it just would be highly, highly irregular, highly unusual. And personally, Nothing against Mr. Turber, but personally, I don't buy it.
Okay. So he says that they were built at Plant 42 by a couple different contractors. The obvious names. He didn't want to reveal who they were other than talking about the list of obvious names, people like Lockheed and Raytheon, et cetera, et cetera. So that part would make sense, that they would be one of those type of companies that would have developed it, right? And then there's the one that they refer to as Gimbal off the East Coast. He claims that one was built by a different contractor. So you actually have at least two contractors that have been building these things at Plant 42. He says that it emanated essentially from the late 80s, from the Star Wars program, et cetera, which does kind of tie in a bit with what you're saying as far as the amount of money being spent on black projects going back to the Reagan administration. And originally flew, original flights in the late 90s. Of course, we know that the Nimitz was 2004, so these things have been around for about 20 years, which is, again, why I asked you the question about the ability to keep secrets, because it's just astounding to me that something could be kept secret theoretically for 20 years. But let me pause there. You said that, yeah, these other projects were kept secret for an extended period of time. If this were real, and he's right that this has been around for 20 years, is it possible that it could have been kept this secret for 20 years?
Oh, yeah. I mean, like I say, secrets keep. I mean, they can keep. It's not that bit that I have an issue with. I mean, secrets can be kept. But as we were saying at the beginning of this interview, it's, as an individual, I would be loath to trust any one data source about, or someone who was telling me something. If that came from one source, I would be really, really loath.
Which is why we're talking to you.
Sure.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, let me.
I'm loving.
Yeah.
And trust me, I'm loving this. But if the technology had been developed in Plant 42 or anywhere else, which I've seen no evidence for, by the way, and I think many colleagues who report these things in much greater depth than I do. I mean, I've been out of the active reporting game with Jane's Defense Weekly for 15 years or so, 12 or 15 years. But I still keep in touch with all of my colleagues. There would have been sniffs and rumors about this stuff. People would have said a bit more than what is being said at the moment. And it just gel with how I understand this business works, that these remarkable physics-defying bits of technology that we've seen in those films could have been developed by Lockheed or Northrop or anyone else. That technology defies belief, and what defies even more belief for me is, had they been developed by any of them, that you'd go out and test them in the way that that is being said that they are being tested against the US Navy in that exercise format. It just wouldn't make much sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go to the next thing that Turber says, and that is that he's actually flown. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say that he says that. He was very careful about how he said it, but he hinted that he has been in one, and he was able to show me. What are you rolling your? Is that an eye roll? Is that what I'm seeing there?
No, I was just scratching my head. I hadn't heard that particular piece of information before, but yeah, go on. So this is very interesting.
So he was able to show me his phone from November 18th of 2017, which shows his Google Maps and so forth. And I don't know if you've ever tracked that on your phone. I had never done it before, but if you want to be tracked, maybe it does it automatically. Maybe you got to turn it on or off or whatever, but it shows you where you went that day. And I can confirm to you, based on reviewing that it indicates that at least his phone, and that's where he was kind of giving me the wink, that it was his phone flew there as opposed to actually him. but he certainly strongly hinted that he was with his phone for this flight. Went from essentially Palmdale, although technically it was Rancho Cucamonga, which is close to Palmdale, to the East Coast. You could imagine where on the East Coast, but he didn't want to exactly disclose that. But you could imagine where on the East Coast he might fly to if it was the Navy flying him there or the Air Force. And according to his phone, the trip took an hour and 24 minutes. So we all know, if you look at the Tic Tac video, that it could have gotten there a hell of a lot faster than that. But he says based on G-force, a human could not stand the G-force that would be exerted by something traveling the speed that you see in the video. So this thing would have flown at 1G, such that it would still go really, really fast, but you wouldn't. The acceleration would be such that it would be okay on a human. And that apparently, if you were to do the calculation of a 1G calculator, that is approximately how long it would take you to get to the East Coast, an hour and 24 minutes. Now, obviously, you could say, oh, gee, Jim, he manipulated his Google map to trick you. Clearly a possibility. But if let's assume he did not, how did he get from the West Coast to the East Coast in an hour and 24 minutes? Are there other types of craft that go that fast? We've had people speculate in response to our YouTube video and so on as far as how he could have gotten there in an hour 24 minutes. They even mentioned some other type of craft, but somebody pointed out that no, that craft has been retired. But I'm not sure there exists any craft in the U.S. military, you tell me if you know different, that could get from the West Coast to the East Coast in an hour and 24 minutes.
Okay, but I mean, the question is taking at face value that there is a craft that can go from the east to the west in that time span, So I mean, look, I don't want to cast aspersions on any one individual, but I will tell you a story about Air Force intelligence and what it is capable of doing. In fact, any intelligence agency and what it's capable of doing. I wouldn't even point the finger at the Air Force. But back in the 1980s, there was a case of a guy called Paul Benowitz, he was an ordinary guy who was kind of interested in home electronics, who sat on the edge of a very secretive Air Force base out in New Mexico, which I've been to, called Kirtland Air Force Base. Kirtland Air Force Base tests all kinds of secret things. And Mr. Benowitz had the misfortune to pick up on his sort of weird electronic bits of kit that he was assembling in his living room, some of the emissions that were coming out of the base. So what Air Force intelligence decided to do is make him believe that he was listening to extraterrestrial communications that were going on from inside the base, and then lights were seen, and who knows, maybe they shone lights on the base to make him think that he was seeing extraterrestrials. And so this poor guy was driven mad by all of this stuff because the story became more and more embellished. So what this should tell us is that there are agencies which are very adept at manipulating information and making us believe things that they want us to believe. So when you get a genuine or an apparently genuine phenomenon like the Tic Tac thing, which is really creating waves, and as I said at the beginning of this, there appears to be a truth at the heart of it, Jim. Whatever that truth is, something happened in that Nimitz carrier group in 2004. But when you get things like that, you get a whole circus now comes around it, and lots of people start jumping in, and all sorts of weird sort of bits of information come out. Active part of the government intelligence machinery's toolkit. So personally speaking, like I say, I like to take with a pinch of salt everything that I hear, and I take no one data point as truth. I data fuse, just like all of those bits of kit in the Nimitz carrier group when it was tracking that UFO. When I pull all those bits of data in, I assemble my own picture and my own story. But what I'm starting to hear around the Tic Tac story, a lot of it just lacks credibility, and I'm afraid I don't even go there.
Yeah. Well, for me, and not being experienced in this area, it was really important to me to hear the Navy confirm that this video is real and that the pilots encountered this, and then to hear the pilots explain it the same way that you agree that, yeah, it appears that there was something that they saw. And as far as potential explanations for what they saw, it seemed to me that it being an earthly aircraft was the most likely explanation, because extraterrestrial is extraterrestrial, and I hadn't given thought yet to your theory about altered realities. But certainly, if you put it, it certainly is one of the potential explanations. And if you applied a percentage to what this thing, what the answer, eventually we're going to learn what it was. And I mean, it might be in 1 year, it might be in 1,000 years, but at some point, presumably, we're going to learn what this was, and that it certainly is a potential that it is earthly. I think you would at least agree with that. That yeah, there's definitely it would be shocking and an unbelievable breakthrough in science, but it's possible that it's earthly in a real craft.
Oh well, listen, I mean, of course, it's possible that it's earthly. As I said, I spent 10 years investigating that whole part of the phenomenon, and I wrote it up in The Hunt for Zero Point, my book that came out in 2001. So yeah, of course it was possible. That was my starting premise. I thought it had to be earthly. But what I found out at the end of that journey was that it would be very foolish of us to ascribe a single point solution to this very complex multifarious phenomenon, which is the UFO phenomenon. It is not that simple. I know, because I spent all that time looking at it, investigating it, and then writing about it. And in the years since, I've sort of cast a weather eye on it, and I keep in touch with all of those sources who helped me out in that book.
But wouldn't you agree but wouldn't you agree, though, the USS Nimitz is a little bit different than most other so-called UFO sightings? I mean, this one has a lot more behind it than your typical sighting, including pretty decent video, multiple pilots, U.S. Navy confirming that it was real. I mean, we've never had that before.
Well, that's another question. You asked me whether the technology at the heart of the sighting was terrestrial. Now, it might be, but that question, the second one about the real bits of kit that make up the Nimitz carrier group, yeah, absolutely. That's what distinguishes the Nimitz carrier sighting, the Tic Tac sighting, is that we do have testimony from multiple witnesses. We've got data apparently from multiple sensors and all fused together, and they saw something. We even have the Navy, and I think this is the real distinguishing feature of this particular sighting, is that the Navy has come forward to say that it was real. That has not happened before. That really pulls this one out from all the other. And there have been multiple sightings by military pilots before. The difference is that no one's actually stood up in the Air Force or the Navy or the Army or anywhere else to say, yep, it really happened. Well, in this case, they did. And that's what distinguishes it. But, your first question to me was the bit of kit, the Tic Tac, the things the objects that were filmed, was that a real terrestrial bit of, earthbound technology? Well, it might have been, but it's unlikely, in my view, given what the pilots said that it could do, which just defies our rational explanation of physics.
But it's my understanding that it doesn't necessarily defy the laws of physics, that it exploits the laws of physics, that it's acknowledged that anti-gravity, or whatever you want to call it, is a possibility under the laws of physics. It's just a real trick to figure out how to do it. Is that, am I saying that properly?
Yeah, in the sense that, of course, if gravity can be manipulated, and there is no evidence yet that it can be, but if it can be, then that is how a craft like Tic Tac would behave. I mean, we would expect to see it maneuver like that. If you can manipulate the gravitational mass of an object, if you can manipulate the inertia of an object, sure. I mean, it would behave like that.
And there's a lot of scientists that believe that is possible to manipulate gravity, whether it's been discovered or not. But that is possible. Yeah.
Of course it's possible. I mean, we have to believe that anything in science is possible. It's just that, according to according to the manifest, it hasn't been discovered yet.
Okay, I know we got limited time, so let me just run two other Turber notes by you, if I could, and then I'll let you go. So, just to read for you quickly what he says. This was actually in a post that he responded to somebody on our YouTube. He says this was a United States Air Force ARL operation in conjunction with DARPA and NRL to test the craft commonly referred to as Tic Tac. Your Tic Tac group were made at Plant 42 and trucked to Vandenberg in 53-foot trucks. The Tic Tac is about 46 feet long, so they can be trucked. From Vandenberg, they were flown low and slow via RPA pilots out past ADIZ. I hope you know these acronyms because I don't. And dipped in just below San Clemente Island, below normal radar. From there, Spy 1B should have acquired their tracks. After that, it was all U.S. Air Force testing how Nimitz CIC would respond in an effort to gain knowledge on how our own forces would react to them. The rest you know. The objects are certainly terrestrial and are ours, and obviously they have advanced propulsion developed by a few universities, and subsequently that technology made its way to DARPA and ARL.
Great. Well, if they're ours, I can sleep easy in my bed tonight. I am really, really happy. That's fantastic news. I'm so pleased. Well, I mean, on a serious note, I would say if that is what he has been told, produce the evidence, because I would truly love to see it. I'd love to see it. I've been covering aerospace all my professional life. I'm fascinated by aerospace. I wrote the book, The Hunt for Zero Point, because I wanted to believe that we could have developed anti-gravity technology. But if he's found proof that we have, great, publish it. I'd love to see it. Truly, I mean it.
So the one other person who has apparently seen this is Kim Jong-un. So I'm going to give you the last piece of Turber revelations, which was that Trump was briefed on this technology soon before Turber learned about it, basically, and we're talking about November of 17. And Trump, being Trump, learns about it and says, well, heck, we can't just let this technology sit around. We got to put this to good use. I'm in the middle of this hot and heavy negotiation over nuclear weapons with Kim Jong-un, trying to get him to back down on nuclear weapons and let him know that, the U.S. is a force to be reckoned with, etc. I'd like to show this off to him, and ordered one flown to North Korea to somehow have it displayed to Kim Jong-un. That part, how they would display it to him, etc., I don't know. But that's part of the Turber revelations.
Did he say whether it was flown by Elvis?
Come on now. Don't go there. Well, I mean,
seriously, I mean, we've kind of been over this, Jim. You know my thoughts and feelings on this. The problem is once somebody goes down a road of saying that this stuff is this or that, they then for it to be believable, they have to produce evidence. So there is no way that anyone would ever want to show an adversary real, potential, active, or not.
Okay, hold on a second. Do I need to remind you who I said ordered it? Donald Trump.
I can't. Well, there we go. I mean, I'm out of here. I'm done. My work here is done.
You get my point. If anybody's going to do something unconventional, it's this president.
Well, yeah. I don't even know where to go with that.
Yeah.
There we go.
Anyway, I wanted to throw it all at you just so you knew the full extent of what it is. I mean, look, obviously.
Well, bless you for that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the last two bits about Turber having flown in one and the Trump story makes his story even more difficult to believe. So, why he would toss those things into it, I don't know. He actually, told me later. He said, "Well, Jim, I really didn't want you to report that I was hinting about having flown in one because I don't want that to detract from the main story. The main story being that these are absolutely ours." And he's indicating that he thinks it's not right that the pilots who are still struggling with this experience that they had, they haven't been clued into what this is. So the commanders knew, yet the pilots themselves still today, one was just interviewed for 2 hours by Joe Rogan, still doesn't know what this was. And he's disseminating the information in part for that reason, but in part because he's saying, hey, this is going to be a slow leak of information out because the news of these is we're going to start learning about more and more.
Well, for my money, we need to focus on the Tic Tac sighting for now. This has only come out really properly in the last year. I mean, not even quite a year yet. And there is so much to study on that alone. The Navy's sighting, as I said, the data that surrounds that has a high degree of verisimilitude about it for me. And makes it worthy of study. The stuff around the periphery of that, for me, is just smoke and mirrors, and it detracts from the real value of what we have, which is we have a branch of the U.S. Armed Services, the U.S. Navy, saying that a phenomenon that its pilots and its carrier groups encountered on both seaboards of the United States over the past 15 years turned out to be real. We should take that seriously. That's a major breakthrough. It says that, all the speculation surrounding what the military believes about UFOs now has something that you can push against, kick the tires of. It's real, but we don't understand what it is. Now let's pick it apart and really try and understand what it is. So, that's where I go. I don't head off into those deeper realms of speculation.
And also, disinformation is a real thing too, right? I mean, theoretically, Turber could be some type of disinformation agent.
Bingo. I mean, it could be. I'm not leveling this at him specifically, but as I said, it is part of the military's mandate to disinform, and there's lots to disinform about, and lots to disinform too. I mean, in the end, it's not. We aren't the sort of the end game of the disinformation loop here. You would want to disinform your adversaries, and if your adversaries are in a nutshell, Russia and China, you would hope that somehow or other this is going to have some impact on them. So, we become the medium, the conduit, the channel through which and by whom this stuff is disseminated to the people you want to get this bad information to. And maybe you hope that they, in some way, get manipulated by it. They waste billions of dollars or rubles or whatever it is developing stuff that perhaps is irrelevant, or you know what I mean.
Right.
It has a purpose, but its purpose is often very hard to see when disinformation is being thrown into the mix.